51 years ago, a toddler vanished without a trace from her Fort Worth home. No ransom note, no witness, just a mother's scream echoing through time. For half a century, detectives, journalists, and strangers searched in vain. Until one tiny strand of DNA rewrote everything they thought they knew. How could a child disappear in daylight, yet grow up only minutes away? And how did science uncover what 5 decades of investigation could not? Before we dive into this unbelievable true story, let us know where you're watching from today. And if you love stories of real-life miracles and modern mysteries, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay till the end. In the summer of 1971, a quiet neighborhood in Fort Worth, Texas, became the setting for a mystery that would span more than half a century. It began with a young mother, a desperate search for help, and one phone call that would change everything. 21-month-old Melissa Highsmith vanished without a sound. There were no witnesses, no ransom note, and no trace. Just the echo of her name whispered through missing child databases and her family's endless prayers. For 51 years, the case lingered like a ghost, older than most detectives who would later take it on, until a truth finally surfaced that shattered every belief about time, distance, and fate. In 1971, Fort Worth was a city caught between tradition and transformation, a growing urban hub where working-class families chased modest dreams while juggling long hours. Among them was 22-year-old Alta Apantenko, a newly single mother trying to rebuild her life after separating from her husband, Jeffrey Highsmith. She adored her baby girl, Melissa, and worked double shifts as a waitress at a small diner downtown, fighting exhaustion just to keep their modest apartment afloat. Reliable childcare was scarce, and affordable babysitters were almost impossible to find. Like many young parents of her generation, Alta turned to the classifieds. She placed a simple ad in the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, asking for a responsible babysitter for weekday care. It was a decision that felt routine at the time, the kind of practical step a mother takes when she has no other choice. But that ad would unknowingly trigger one of the longest and most haunting missing child investigations in American history. Within days, a woman called herself Ruth Johnson and responded to the ad. Her voice was calm, polite, and confident, the kind of voice that inspires trust. Ruth spoke of her experience with children, described a spacious home with a large yard, and sounded reassuringly professional. The two women agreed to meet at Alta's workplace, but when the day came, Ruth never showed. Instead, she called again, apologizing for the inconvenience with a poise that lowered Alta's suspicions. Pressed for time and with no family nearby to lean on, Alta made a decision she would replay in her mind for the next 5 decades. She hired Ruth over the phone. On the morning of August 23, 1971, Alta left early for work, arranging for her roommate to hand Melissa to the new babysitter later that morning. Around 9 o'clock, a woman arrived at the Spanish Gate Apartments on East Seminary Drive. The roommate remembered her clearly. Soft-spoken, neatly dressed, confident, yet something about her seemed out of place. It was a scorching Texas morning, well over 100 degrees, yet the woman wore long white gloves, a scarf around her neck, and a bonnet that concealed much of her face. Her outfit was elegant but strange, too formal for the occasion, as if she were headed to Sunday service rather than babysitting a toddler. Still, nothing in her demeanor felt threatening. Introducing herself as Ruth Johnson, she smiled warmly, took Melissa in her arms, and thanked the roommate before walking out into the sunlit parking lot. That was the last time anyone saw her. When Alta returned home that evening, she expected to hear her daughter's giggles or see her toys scattered on the floor. Instead, the apartment was silent. Melissa's bottle sat untouched, her crib neatly made. At first, Alta assumed there had been a misunderstanding. Maybe the babysitter had taken Melissa to her house nearby. But as hours slipped into darkness with no word, confusion gave way to fear. By nightfall, panic consumed her. She called neighbors, searched the complex, and finally, just after 8 that night, she contacted the Fort Worth Police Department. Officers arrived, interviewed Alta and her roommate, and began the procedures for what they suspected was an abduction. They couldn't have known that this case, one tiny child gone without a trace, would one day rewrite everything they thought they knew about loss, hope, and the miracles that can hide in plain sight. Detectives quickly determined there was no record of anyone named Ruth Johnson matching the woman's description. No employment files, no rental listings, no trace of her in local databases. The roommate's account became the only clue investigators had, and even that felt frustratingly vague. But one detail stood out: the long white gloves and headscarf. Detectives began to suspect those accessories weren't quirks of style. They were deliberate, a calculated disguise. In an era before advanced forensics, even simple logic suggested what the woman was doing. The gloves would prevent fingerprints. The bonnet and scarf would hide her hair color and features. What had first appeared eccentric now looked like strategy. Police canvassed every corner of East Seminary Drive, questioning shop owners, residents, and bus drivers. No one remembered seeing a woman carrying a toddler matching Melissa's description. Officers checked taxi companies, hospitals, and bus stations, even combing through wooded areas and drainage ditches near the freeway. But the search turned up nothing. No baby items, no clothing, not even a footprint. By the second day, the Federal Bureau of Investigation became involved, classifying the disappearance as a likely kidnapping under federal abduction statutes. Flyers were distributed across Texas and neighboring states, bearing a small photo of Melissa, her bright eyes frozen in time above the words, "Missing Fort Worth." Newspapers printed the story on their front pages, but investigators were racing against the limitations of 1971. There were no surveillance cameras, no digital records, no credit card trails. The mysterious babysitter had used a landline, probably from a public payphone, leaving nothing traceable behind. Every lead depended on memory, and memories fade. Police questioned Alta repeatedly, following standard procedure to rule out family involvement. Her recent separation from Melissa's father, Jeffrey, raised initial suspicion, but both parents were cleared early on. There were no custody disputes, no history of neglect, and no indication that either had orchestrated a disappearance. The community rallied to help. Volunteers searched vacant lots and wooded trails. Churches held candlelight vigils, and television stations aired emotional pleas featuring Alta's tearful request for her daughter's return. Still, no credible witnesses ever emerged. As weeks stretched into months, the case grew colder. Police reports recorded the same chilling refrain. All leads exhausted, no viable suspects. Ruth Johnson had become a phantom, an identity that seemed to exist only in Alta's tragedy. The image of the woman in white gloves became the case's haunting symbol, a portrait of precision and anonymity. Detectives in private confessed their frustration. Without a crime scene, vehicle, or eyewitness, there was nothing to reconstruct. It was as if someone had executed a perfect disappearance. For Alta, life froze in place. She quit her job, spending her days answering phone calls and chasing rumors, returning again and again to the apartment, hoping some overlooked clue might reveal itself. At night, she replayed every word, the tone of that soft, persuasive voice, the promise of a large yard, the description of an experienced babysitter. Every decision she had made now felt unbearable. Eventually, the Fort Worth Police Department closed the active search, transferring the case to the Missing Persons Division. The file remained open but untouched, waiting, like a silent clock, for something new. As the years slipped by, Melissa's photo, her small bow and wide smile, faded from newspaper pages into archives. What endured was the stark image of that sweltering August morning. A polite stranger, a trusting mother, and a moment that altered the course of an entire family's history. The woman in white gloves had taken far more than a child that day. She had carried away a lifetime. She had taken more than a child that day. She had stolen certainty itself, leaving behind a void filled only with questions no one could answer. By the end of 1971, the name Melissa Highsmith had joined a growing and heartbreaking list of missing children across America. A reflection of an era unprepared for crimes that relied on trust instead of force. Unlike many other abductions marked by chaos or violence, Melissa's story began with something far quieter. A mother's faith in the kindness of a stranger. That fragile trust, offered to a woman dressed too carefully for the Texas heat, vanished just as completely as the woman herself. When the investigation began in late August, detectives believed it would resolve quickly. Statistically, most missing child cases reach their critical point within 48 hours, the window where hope either survived or closed. But for Melissa, 48 hours turned into weeks, weeks into months, and months into decades. Despite the combined efforts of the Fort Worth police and the FBI, the trail went cold almost instantly. There were no ransom notes, no patterns linking the case to organized kidnappings, no evidence of violence, nothing. The silence surrounding Melissa's disappearance became its most haunting feature. Investigators agreed it had been premeditated. But how do you track someone who, on paper, never existed? They had no name, no address, and not a single credible witness. The case dissolved into unanswered questions. Alta Apantenko remained under the microscope for months, as was common in child abductions. But detectives found no reason to suspect her. What they did find was a woman consumed by guilt and grief, Her life became a cycle of police interviews, sleepless nights, and an endless loop of what-ifs. Every detail replayed in her mind: the phone calls, the polite voice on the line, the mention of a large yard. She kept Melissa's photo by her bedside, as if the child might somehow find her way back through memory alone. The FBI kept the case technically open under the Federal Kidnapping Act, but with no proof that Melissa had been taken across state lines, jurisdiction was limited. By the mid-1970s, newer cases buried the old ones, and Melissa's file slipped into the growing backlog of unsolved disappearances that defined the pre-digital era. The file number remained active, but the momentum was gone. Only the family's determination endured. Alta and Melissa's father, Jeffrey Highsmith, eventually built separate lives. Time brought distance, but it never dissolved the bond of shared loss. Across the following decades, they chased every rumor, every fleeting lead. A waitress in Oklahoma, a teenager in Louisiana, a woman in New Mexico who looked just like her. Each new possibility reignited hope, and each false lead extinguished it again. Hope became both a lifeline and a torment. By the 1980s and 90s, America was waking up to the crisis of missing children. New technologies, computer-assisted age progression and facial matching, offered fragile promise. The Highsmiths sent Melissa's childhood photos to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, which produced renderings of what she might look like as she grew. Those images appeared in flyers, public service announcements, and even late-night TV broadcasts. Tips flooded in. None of them led home. When DNA testing emerged in the 1990s, the family submitted samples to every available lab. The process was slow, the databases small, and cross-referencing rare. Each result came back the same: no match. But Alta refused to speak of closure. To her, that word felt like surrender. By the end of the decade, public attention had faded. News outlets rarely revisited cases without new developments, and Fort Worth police faced overwhelming caseloads. With limited resources, more than 1,000 cold cases rested in dusty drawers, each one a family waiting for an answer. At one point, every missing person file in the department was assigned to a single detective, a nearly impossible burden that left most stories, like Melissa's, suspended in time. By the early 2000s, the Highsmith family found new hope in an emerging tool: the internet. In 2000, Melissa's siblings, now adults who had grown up surrounded by their parents' grief and determination, created a Facebook page called Finding Melissa Highsmith. It became both a living archive and a rallying point. Every known photo, article clipping, and age-progressed image was uploaded with the same plea: help us bring her home. The page began drawing attention from true crime communities, advocacy groups, and online investigators who specialized in long-term missing person cases. Through the rise of social media, Melissa's story reached corners of the world that print papers never could, sparking interest from amateur genealogists, retired detectives, and countless ordinary people fascinated by the mystery that had endured since 1971. Online forums like Web Sleuths revisited the case frequently, dissecting the old clues, the gloves, the scarf, the lack of witnesses, and debating theories that had haunted Fort Worth for decades. Each new generation of internet users rediscovered the case, reigniting conversations and hope. Occasionally, new sketches or age-progressed renderings would surface, stirring a fresh wave of attention. Some women even came forward, believing they might be Melissa, their memories fractured by adoption or childhood trauma. Each claim brought cautious optimism, followed by the inevitable heartbreak of another negative DNA result. For Alta, these moments became a cruel pattern of hope and disappointment. Over the years, she learned to read DNA reports with a steady, clinical calm, but the emotional impact never softened. Every time the phone rang, she later said, "I thought maybe this is it," and then it wasn't. Meanwhile, public frustration toward the Fort Worth Police Department grew louder. Local newspapers published editorials questioning how such a public, emotional case could sit stagnant for decades. Activists demanded more funding for the city's cold case unit, arguing that families like the Highsmiths had been left to do the detective work themselves. Department spokespeople admitted the truth. One detective handling more than 1,000 files could not possibly give each case the care it deserved. Through it all, the Highsmiths never stopped. Their persistence became a quiet symbol of resilience. Every November, on Melissa's birthday, they gathered for a small celebration: a cake, a single candle, and a whispered vow: "We'll bring you home." Alta maintained that tradition even when others begged her to let go. Neighbors often saw her place a lone candle by the window, its flicker glowing against the dark. When asked why she still kept hope after all those years, she would smile softly and say, "Because I haven't seen her. Until I do, she's not gone." As time wore on, the emotional weight passed to the next generation. Melissa's siblings took up the search, connecting with nonprofit organizations, online investigators, and DNA testing companies. They learned how to navigate digital archives, submit genealogy requests, and advocate for change. But with every passing decade, the odds grew longer. Many cases from the early 70s ended only in speculation, not discovery. Some skeptics began to wonder if the woman who took Melissa had already died, taking the secret with her. The family refused to believe that. The rise of genetic genealogy, a revolutionary field capable of solving cases once thought unsolvable, gave them new direction. They uploaded DNA profiles, cross-referenced databases, and watched as science began to succeed, where decades of searching had failed. Through it all, Alta aged quietly. The years etched deep lines into her face, but her faith remained unshaken. When asked how she could still believe after 50 years, her answer was simple and profound. "Belief isn't a choice," she said. "It's survival. If I stop believing she's alive, I lose her twice." Publicly, the Highsmith case faded in and out of the headlines, another cold file among thousands. But privately, it never stopped echoing through one family's life. In their home, Melissa's name was still spoken at the dinner table, still written on birthday cakes, still whispered into prayers at night. A presence made eternal by her very absence. Even as Fort Worth transformed, its skyline rising, its streets expanding, its archives shifting from paper to pixels, one small photograph never left the bulletin board inside the police department. It showed a toddler in a white dress, smiling at the camera in 1971. By 2020, the case had been reopened and re-examined several times, but not a single new lead had surfaced. What little evidence existed had been carefully preserved, though it offered no path forward. For detectives, it remained one of Texas's longest-running unsolved abductions, a painful reminder of investigative limits. But for the Highsmith family, it was never a failure. It was a testament to faith that refused to die. Half a century after that hot August morning, the world had changed beyond recognition. Technology, policing, communication. Yet one haunting question remained. Where is Melissa? When the answer finally began to take shape, it didn't emerge from an interrogation room or a cold case file. It came from something unimaginable in 1971, a single strand of DNA, uploaded to a public website by a father who had never stopped searching. By early 2022, Melissa's disappearance had become one of the oldest unresolved abduction cases in the United States. For most families, such stories fade quietly with time, replaced by new generations and other priorities. But not for the Highsmiths. Their digital trail, the website, the Facebook page, the online forums, kept the case alive long after the headlines had vanished. Then, in September 2022, something unexpected happened. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children received an anonymous tip from Charleston, South Carolina. The caller claimed to have seen a woman who bore a striking resemblance to one of the age-progressed images of Melissa. She was said to be in her early 50s, with facial features eerily similar to the digital composite distributed years before. When the tip reached Fort Worth authorities, it was quickly forwarded to the Highsmith family. For Alta's surviving children, now adults with families of their own, it felt different this time. "We'd heard so many rumors over the years," one sibling said. But something about this one felt real. Pooling their savings, the family bought plane tickets and flew to South Carolina within days. They passed out flyers showing baby Melissa alongside the age-progressed portraits. Local news picked up the story, broadcasting interviews under headlines like, "Could missing Fort Worth girl be living in Charleston?" But within a week, DNA results crushed their hope again. The woman wasn't Melissa. Another false dawn. Normally, it would have ended there. Just another heartbreak in a 51-year cycle of disappointment. But this time, something was different. The trip to Charleston reminded them that technology and public attention could still move mountains, even after half a century. It also forced them to confront a new truth. While traditional police work had stalled, science had evolved in extraordinary ways. Back home in Texas, Melissa's father, Jeffrey Highsmith, began researching consumer DNA testing kits. Companies like 23andMe and Ancestry DNA that helped ordinary people trace their ancestry and find relatives. He'd heard of them before, but never thought they could apply to his daughter's case. In his mind, DNA was something handled by law enforcement, not families. Their information, he assumed, would never enter official databases. But in late October 2022, after the Charleston lead fell through, a close family friend, a passionate amateur genealogist, challenged that assumption. "You've tried everything else," she told him. "Why not this?" It was deceptively simple. One saliva sample mailed to a lab, analyzed through advanced algorithms that compared genetic markers to millions of profiles worldwide. The odds were slim, but for a father who had refused to give up for 51 years, even the smallest chance was enough. For the Highsmiths, even a 1% chance was worth everything. On November 22, 2022, 3 weeks after Jeffrey mailed his DNA kit, an email appeared in his inbox. At first, he barely noticed it, assuming it was another ancestry update or ethnicity breakdown, but when he opened it, the words on the screen froze him in place. DNA match found. Direct parental relation. The match wasn't with Melissa herself. It was with 3 adult children, people who shared half of his DNA. The system classified them as a 100% genetic match consistent with a grandparent-grandchild connection. Jeffrey read the line again and again, unsure if he was interpreting it correctly. Then he called one of his daughters, who had been helping manage the family's online search campaign. Together they reviewed the data, compared the account names, and slowly began to understand what it meant. Whoever these 3 children were, their mother had to be Melissa. The next step was confirmation. The family contacted 23andMe's support team, explaining the decades-old missing person case and asking how to verify the match. Because of strict privacy laws, the company couldn't release identifying information. However, through the platform's internal messaging system, they were allowed to send a single message to the account connected to those profiles. While waiting for a reply, the Highsmiths reached out to Lisa Jo Sheila, a clinical laboratory scientist and veteran genetic genealogist, who volunteered to interpret the results. After reviewing the data, Sheila confirmed what Jeffrey could hardly let himself believe. "There's no mistake here," she said. "The probability these individuals aren't related to you is effectively 0. The genetic trail didn't lead to another state or country. It pointed straight back to Fort Worth, the same city where Melissa had disappeared 51 years earlier. We searched the world," Jeffrey would later say, "but she'd been right here the whole time." The realization felt surreal. Half a century of looking outward, across maps and state lines, only to discover the answer had always been close enough to drive to. Still, before they could be certain, they needed to find the woman whose DNA matched. Using public records and social media, Sheila and the Highsmiths traced the profile to a woman named Melanie Walden. Her date of birth matched Melissa's, and she had 3 adult children, the same 3 names from the database. But after decades of heartbreak, the family hesitated. Jeffrey decided to reach out himself. On Facebook Messenger, he typed a simple, cautious message. "Hi, my name is Jeffrey Highsmith. I believe I may be your biological father. I've been searching for my daughter, Melissa, for 51 years. For Melanie, the message seemed like an obvious scam. Someone claiming to be her father after 50 years. She ignored it. But a few days later, her husband grew curious. He searched the name Melissa Highsmith online and found the Finding Melissa Highsmith Facebook page. As he scrolled through the photos and old newspaper clippings, one image stopped him cold. A baby in a white dress whose face looked exactly like his wife's childhood picture. The resemblance was undeniable. The same eyes, the same expression, even a faint birthmark near the eye. He turned the screen toward her without saying a word. Melanie stared for a long moment, the shock rippling through her. The dates, the age, the details, they all aligned. Something deep inside her shifted from disbelief to realization. Meanwhile, Jeffrey and his family waited in silence, checking their messages every few minutes. Then, late one evening, a notification appeared. "Melanie Walden has replied to your message." The exchange was brief but life-altering. Melanie agreed to speak cautiously and to take an independent DNA test for confirmation. The family arranged everything privately. No police, no reporters, no announcements. After 51 years of public appeals and false leads, the truth that had eluded investigators for generations was now unfolding quietly between 2 strangers on social media. For Jeffrey, even as he read her words, the reality felt too immense to grasp. The search that had defined his life was finally nearing its end, and it had all begun with a single email, a simple test, and an unbroken belief that his daughter was still out there. "I didn't know what to believe," Jeffrey would later admit, but the science didn't lie. For the first time in 51 years, there was something real, something measurable. Not another rumor, not another desperate sighting, but proof. By late November of 2022, the Highsmiths were preparing for the unthinkable, meeting the woman they believed to be Melissa. Before taking that step, they agreed to one final DNA test, this time through a certified forensic laboratory rather than a consumer service. The waiting stretched across several agonizing days. When Alta, now in her 70s, was told about the potential match, her reaction was careful, almost guarded. "I've had my hopes raised before," she said softly. "If it's true, I'll know when I see her." Just before Thanksgiving, the results arrived. The lab confirmed what 23andMe had already revealed. The markers aligned perfectly. The little girl who had vanished in 1971 was alive. Her name, her life story, those details could come later. For now, one truth was enough. The impossible had happened. After half a century of pain, the search that had defined generations finally had an answer. And what stunned everyone most wasn't how far they'd gone to find her, but how close she had been all along. That email from November of 2022 had given the Highsmith family something they hadn't felt in decades: certainty. But even certainty demanded confirmation strong enough to silence doubt. Once again, they turned to Lisa Jo Sheila, the genetic genealogist who had guided them through the labyrinth of data. Sheila re-examined the DNA results, cross-checking them against public registries and lineage charts. The conclusion was irrefutable. 3 adult profiles in Fort Worth shared a direct first-degree genetic relationship with Jeffrey Highsmith. When she mapped the genetic connections, only one configuration fit. They were his biological grandchildren, the children of the daughter who had disappeared 51 years ago. From there, Sheila and the Highsmiths traced the evidence backward through public records, addresses, and social media clues. It led to a woman named Melanie Walden, born in 1970, the same year as Melissa Suzanne Highsmith. The parallels were impossible to ignore. She lived in Fort Worth. She was in her early 50s. Her early records showed inconsistencies: no listed hospital, and a birth certificate filed several years after 1971. Then came the detail that made the digital data feel human again. Through a combination of old family photos and metadata from social media posts, Sheila noticed a small, faint birthmark just beneath Melanie's left eye, identical to one visible in baby Melissa's pictures. "There's no algorithm for that," Sheila said later. "That's visual truth." Armed with the evidence, Jeffrey sent a message on Facebook that would forever change both of their lives. "My name is Jeffrey Highsmith. I believe you might be my daughter. I've been searching for Melissa for 51 years. For Melanie, the message was bewildering. She had grown up in Fort Worth, attended local schools, lived a perfectly ordinary life. No one had ever hinted that her origins were anything unusual. The idea that a stranger was now claiming to be her father felt absurd, if not a scam. She showed the message to her husband, shaking her head. "People will say anything online," she said. But her husband was curious. He searched the name Melissa Highsmith online and stumbled upon the Finding Melissa Highsmith Facebook page, the same page her siblings had maintained for over 2 decades. He scrolled through old photographs, yellowed newspaper clippings, and emotional appeals. Then one image stopped him cold: a baby in a white dress smiling softly toward the camera. The resemblance was undeniable. He called Melanie over. Together they compared that image to her own childhood photos tucked away in a family album. The eyes, the nose, even the slight curve of the lips, they matched perfectly. And there it was, the faint birthmark under the left eye. "That's you," her husband whispered. For the first time, Melanie didn't have a response. The next day, she opened her inbox and typed a careful reply to Jeffrey's message. Her tone was cautious but open. 2 lives, separated by half a century, beginning to reconnect through a few quiet words on a screen. 51 years of searching, Jeffrey told a reporter, and all it took was a tiny strand of DNA to bring her home. For Melissa, now reclaiming her birth name, the reunion was not an ending but a beginning, a long-delayed chapter finally opening. "I finally know who I am," she said quietly. In the official case file, the resolution took only a few words. Subject located. Case closed. But for those who lived it, the story didn't close at all. It merely shifted from loss to rediscovery. At the heart of it was something profoundly simple: proof that science had caught up to faith, and that a single message, reading a match found, could rewrite half a century of history. For 51 years, Melissa Highsmith had lived under another name, in another life, less than 20 minutes from where she had been taken. The distance separating her 2 worlds could be crossed in one short drive, but emotionally it spanned a lifetime. As she began to piece together her past, fragmented memories suddenly made sense. She realized that many of the peculiarities of her upbringing, the secrecy, the isolation, the rigid control, hadn't been protective at all. They had been the deliberate tactics of someone hiding a crime. Melissa's early years as Melanie Walden were shaped by instability and fear. The woman who raised her, the same woman Melissa would later identify as her abductor, controlled every detail of her existence. She wasn't allowed to play with neighborhood kids or attend school events. Days often passed with her locked indoors, told that she was too fragile, too different to go outside. When Melissa asked why, the woman always gave the same chilling explanation. You were born at home. You have brain damage. The world out there could hurt you. It was a lie, a cruel fabrication that twisted Melissa's view of herself and bound her emotionally to her captor. I used to wonder why she even kept me if she didn't want me, Melissa said later. I just thought I was a burden. Physical punishment and emotional manipulation were constant companions in her childhood. She learned quickly that affection was conditional, and silence meant safety. In the absence of real friends or family, her world became the one her abductor constructed for her. A life of obedience, confusion, and invisible walls. I thought I was born to the wrong person, she admitted. But I didn't know how to explain that feeling. By the time she reached 15, the walls closed in completely. One day, driven purely by survival instinct, Melissa ran away. I didn't have anywhere to go, she recalled, but I knew I couldn't stay. Her teenage years that followed were turbulent. Living on the streets, sleeping in temporary shelters, taking odd jobs just to survive. Sometimes, she said, I did whatever I had to do to get by. By 19, she was a young mother with 3 children of her own. By 20, she had lost custody of them, a devastating repetition of the loss that had defined her own life. The instability and trauma that began with her abduction echoed through every choice she made, every connection she tried to rebuild. Decades later, after the DNA confirmation, Melissa finally reached out to the woman who had raised her. They hadn't spoken in years, but Melissa needed the truth. Through a series of tense messages, she asked the question that had haunted her entire life. Who am I really? The answer she received was both shocking and evasive. The woman admitted she had known all along. I knew you were that baby, she wrote. The baby from the missing posters in 1971. The one from Fort Worth. When Melissa pressed further, the woman claimed she hadn't kidnapped her at all, that she had bought her in 1972 for $500 from another woman who supposedly couldn't care for the child. It wasn't kidnapping, she insisted. It was a private arrangement. Melissa didn't believe her. In my heart, she said later, I don't think she bought me. I think she took me. There was no way to verify the story. The woman's records were incomplete, her timeline full of holes. What remained was the unshakable truth that Melissa Highsmith, taken as a toddler, hidden in plain sight for more than 5 decades, had survived. And through a miracle of faith and science, she had finally come home. The woman who had raised Melissa died before police could question her, taking her secrets with her and leaving behind only contradictions. Investigators reviewing the evidence agreed that her claim of having bought the child was implausible. There were no records, no witnesses, and no trace of any informal adoption. Everything, from the false name Ruth Johnson to the gloves, scarf, and bonnet described by Alta's roommate in 1971, fit the profile of a calculated abduction, not a private arrangement. For Melissa, that revelation was devastating yet clarifying. It allowed her to finally reinterpret her life, to recognize that what once felt like isolated acts of control and secrecy had all been deliberate. I understand now why I was kept away from people, she said. If anyone had looked too closely, they would have known I didn't belong there. Even after finding her family, Melissa struggled to reconcile her 2 identities. The reunion brought overwhelming joy but also confusion. Her memories were not of Alta and Jeffrey, but of the woman who had stolen her from them. Her childhood, her name, even her understanding of who she was, had all been built on lies. It's like I lived someone else's life, she said softly, and now I have to learn mine. Psychologists call it identity deprivation, a trauma in which victims adapt to a false reality so completely that it becomes indistinguishable from truth. Dr. Elizabeth Loftus, a leading expert on memory, once described such cases as living amnesia. It isn't that memory fails, it's that it was never allowed to form. Melissa's story embodied that concept perfectly. The abduction had not only stolen her from her family, it had stolen her right to remember herself. After the reunion, Melissa began therapy to confront the decades of buried trauma. She also reached out to her 3 adult children, who had grown up believing their mother's early life was ordinary. Everything they thought they knew about our family changed overnight, she said. Together, they began piecing together a truth larger than any of them had imagined. In May of 2023, surrounded by her biological parents and a room full of relatives and reporters, Melissa stood before a judge in Tarrant County, Texas, to reclaim her name. The court order read simply, Melissa Suzanne Highsmith. When the judge signed it, the courtroom erupted in applause. For Melissa, it wasn't just a legal correction. It was a restoration of her identity, a reclaiming of her story after 51 stolen years. That moment of triumph didn't erase the pain, but it marked a turning point. She had regained her name, her history, and her family. Yet beneath the relief simmered a quiet anger. Not for the years she had lost, but for how easily it had all been hidden. I grew up just a few miles away, she said. All that time we were so close. How could no one see? There was no easy answer. Her question revealed the limits of an era before surveillance, databases, or digital footprints, when a stranger could walk into an apartment, take a child, and vanish without leaving a trace. In 1971, the world had failed to protect her. In 2022, a single strand of DNA had undone half a century of silence. For me, Melissa said, that's the story. DNA won. But it took 51 years to find me. The Highsmiths refused to let their miracle become just another headline. They turned their pain into purpose, a message for families still searching for loved ones. In every interview since the reunion, Jeffrey, Alta, and Melissa's siblings repeat the same words that had sustained them for half a century. Never give up. Follow every lead. Believe in science. And above all, believe in family. Those words, never give up, follow every lead, believe in science, and believe in family, quickly became a mantra across a growing network of families using DNA to search for missing loved ones. The Highsmiths, once ordinary parents trapped in an extraordinary tragedy, transformed into advocates for what they called the new way of searching. They turned their once singular Facebook page, Finding Melissa Highsmith, into a broader community hub for families navigating the same labyrinth of loss. The page evolved into a living forum for genealogical tracing, where volunteers, amateur researchers, and parents shared practical advice on interpreting results from services like 23andMe and Ancestry DNA. Soon, messages poured in from across the country, and even overseas. Some came from parents still searching for abducted children. Others were adoptees trying to trace their biological roots. Dozens of people asked how to upload raw DNA data, interpret family tree matches, or reach genetic counselors. The Highsmiths, now well-versed in the process, responded personally. We can't solve every case, Melissa wrote in one post, but we can help people understand the tools that might. What began as one family's private grief grew into a grassroots support network, a digital gathering place where science met empathy. Beneath photos of the reunited family, comments flooded in. Your story gave me the courage to test my DNA. Thank you for showing us it's not too late. The impact was amplified by national media. In the weeks after the reunion, major outlets like The Washington Post, The New York Times, People, and CNN covered the story as a symbol of what perseverance and technology could achieve together. Each headline echoed the same theme, that the Highsmith case wasn't solved by luck, but by relentless hope paired with science. CNN called it a triumph of determination and DNA. The New York Times described it as one of the longest-running missing child cases ever solved through consumer genetics. The Washington Post called it a Thanksgiving miracle rooted in data, and the phrase coined by the Highsmiths themselves. DNA wins, spread across the internet, becoming shorthand for the quiet revolution of genetic genealogy. The story's success reignited national debate about the role of private DNA testing in criminal and missing person investigations. Commentators pointed out that a mystery which had stumped law enforcement for half a century was unraveled in weeks using tools accessible to any citizen. Lawmakers and privacy advocates began discussing the balance between personal rights and the moral good of solving long-dormant cases. Meanwhile, the Highsmiths focused on what mattered most, helping others. They offered guidance, built connections, and provided emotional support to families still waiting for their own reunions. Now in her 50s, Melissa began speaking publicly at community events and online panels about identity recovery and trauma resilience. Her words were simple, grounded, and unsentimental. I lost 51 years, she said in one interview. That time doesn't come back. But if my story helps someone else find their family, that's what matters. By the end of 2022, the story had become more than a personal triumph. It was part of the national conversation. Amid years of grim headlines, the Highsmith reunion became a symbol of hope, a Thanksgiving miracle that reminded people what human persistence and modern science could do together. The ripple effects reached academia and law enforcement as well. At a 2023 Forensic Science Conference, researchers cited the Highsmith case as a turning point in how open-source DNA databases could complement traditional policing, especially in under-resourced jurisdictions. Some departments even launched pilot programs to train officers in interpreting genealogical matches and supporting family-initiated searches. What began with one family's faith had grown into a cultural shift, proof that sometimes the greatest breakthroughs don't start in a lab or a courtroom, but in the heart of a family that refuses to stop looking. In the wake of the Highsmith discovery, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children launched a new initiative to partner with private DNA companies, explicitly citing the Highsmith recovery as its inspiration. It changed how we think about old cases, one NCMEC official said. Families aren't just waiting anymore, they're investigating. The movement that began with one family's perseverance had now reshaped an entire system. For the Highsmiths, their mission evolved beyond advocacy, it became legacy. Their story stood as living proof that faith and technology could coexist, that belief in miracles didn't have to contradict belief in data. Their daughter's return was both a spiritual revelation and a scientific triumph, a union of prayer and progress. By the end of 2023, finding Melissa Highsmith had connected with more than 30 families searching for their own missing relatives through DNA tracing. Some found partial matches, a few achieved full reunions. Each success reaffirmed the same truth. Even the coldest cases can thaw when met with persistence, patience, and science. Reflecting on the journey, Jeffrey spoke with quiet conviction. For 51 years we were looking in all the wrong places, he said. Now we tell people, look everywhere, but don't forget to look close. Alta, now in her 70s, rarely spoke to reporters, choosing instead to spend her days surrounded by her reunited family. Yet when asked what message she wanted others to take from her story, her reply was simple and unwavering. Don't stop believing, and don't wait for someone else to find them. You can be the one. For the American public, the case of Melissa Highsmith endures as both a miracle and a mirror, a reminder that the answers to even the longest mysteries may not depend on chance or distance, but on the quiet, relentless act of refusing to give up. And if you believe in second chances, in science, and in stories that prove no hope is ever truly lost, follow the channel, share your thoughts below, and stay with us for more true stories where faith, fate, and truth finally meet. Half a century of heartbreak ended with a single email, proof that faith and science can walk hand in hand. The Highsmith family's story reminds us that even when hope feels lost, truth has a way of finding its way home. A mother's prayer, a father's persistence, and a daughter's rediscovery, all woven together by one miracle of modern DNA. If this story moved you, share it, comment your thoughts below, and remember, every lost story deserves to be found. Subscribe for more true stories where faith, fate, and truth finally meet.